Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fall 2021 Brookings panel on economic activity. We have a packed program today, so we want to jump right into the papers, but let me first remind you of the usual ground rules now that we're in virtual mode. Everything is on the record and also being live streamed and recorded. When we come to the question and answer period, I'll call on people on Zoom. So please raise your hands in the Zoom window and I'll call on people from the participant list from there. I'll ask everyone to please be mindful of the time because we do have a very tight schedule today. And we'll start with our first paper, which is the employment impact of a green fiscal push, evidence from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The authors are all listed on the program, so let me just introduce the presenting author, David Pop.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can everybody see my presentation? All right, so thank you for the introduction. As we said, all the co-authors are here and we'll be able to help answer questions. So the motivation for this paper, there's growing interest in a green fiscal stimulus. So examples would be the US American Jobs Plan, in the EU, the European Green Deal, which is inspired by the Green Deal proposed by some of the Democrats in the US. And these have been designed not just to restart the economy, but plans like this were being talked about before the pandemic. And one major goal was to create green jobs for workers potentially displaced by a green transition. Right? So there are both short run and long run concerns. Right? So the graph on the side here shows employment trends in oil and gas extraction, coal mining, fossil fuels, where you see these have all been steadily declining in the 21st century. Increase in renewable electric power generation employment, but certainly not at a scale that would replace all these jobs lost here. So our paper addresses three questions to think about the potential of green fiscal stimuli as part of a green energy transition. So first, we'll take a brief look at what the existing literature says about environmental policies and employment. Second, think about the employment options for workers in these polluting industries with declining job prospects, particularly think about their skills and what we might want to know to determine their ability to be reemployed. And then the main focus of the paper is to look at the extent that these green government investments can be used to create new jobs. And to do that, we're going to focus on the effect of the green stimulus from the 2009 American Recovery and Investment Act, or ARA, on local employment. So let me begin with lessons from the existing literature. So most of the work that looks at the effect of employment and environmental policies is looking at a cost of pollution. So what's the impact of regulation or cap and trade or carbon tax? There's very little research looking at the job creation effect of green subsidies. For the work looking at the effects of regulation on employment, the studies that look at the overall market will try to find a very small aggregated effects of employment. But more recent work focusing on specific sectors or specific types of workers find that there are areas of the economy that are hurt, right? That heavily polluting sectors see employment losses, and that manual labor workers, particularly low-skilled male workers, also seeing job losses, given that these are the same kind of trends that we're seeing also due to automation and globalization. But this is a concern certainly for the politics of greening the economy. We also see in the literature the importance of worker skills. Reed Walker's work looking at workers displaced by the US Clean Air Act in 1990 finds the foregone earnings are largest for workers that end up changing sectors. And more broadly in the labor literature, there's evidence that reallocation costs and reemployability is proportional to the skill distance between jobs that people are moving to and from. All right, so turning to skills. So our work on green employment and green skills is based off of work that we did. It was published in Jerry in 2018, where we used data from the Department of Labor's ONET database to define what we call green general skills. The way to think of these green general skills are skills that are used potentially in all occupations, but the green general skills are ones that are particularly important for green jobs. Having said that, it's important to note they're not exclusive to green jobs. So for example, physicians use what are considered green general skills, mining machine operators, which is obviously relevant for our green transition transportation workers. So these are skills that are used in multiple sectors. This table here is a shorter version of stuff that's in the paper. This is focusing just on low skilled workers. And so we're looking at some descriptive data on brown fossil fuel occupations, green renewable and other greens. So these would be things like hazardous waste remediation and so on. And then a benchmark, which are other occupations also in the same 2-digit classification. What we'll see here is that green renewable in particular pays better than other jobs. Brown fossil fuel occupations have comparable wages to green other, and the benchmark jobs pay less. Location is a very important issue, right? So fossil fuel jobs and green jobs are very location specific compared to the benchmark. Brown fuel, as we said, is primarily male. And one last thing we know here is that training requirements are higher for green jobs than for other jobs. Turning to skills, this table shows an important scale for our 4 classes of green general skills. So these all range from 0 to 1, 1 meaning these skills are more important in these occupations. What we'll see is that we compare the fossil fuel occupations to other green occupations, so not green renewable. We see very similar skill requirements. Right? Compared to green renewable, there is a difference. Green renewable places more emphasis on engineering and operations management skills in particular. However, compared to the benchmark, right, brown and green jobs are much more similar than either one is to the benchmark. So there is a decent match between brown, particularly with other green occupations, not as much necessarily with green renewable. Okay. So with that, we'll turn to the effect of a green stimulus on jobs. And we start looking at the data. So the 2009 ARA stimulus was over 800 billion. That included several programs. They were designed to promote green energy and green jobs. So we use in this paper all the stimulus money spent by the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency as green. This includes things like cleaning up polluted waste sites, energy efficiency retrofits were a big part of this, the development of renewable energy resources. About 10% of this goes to R&D. There's a very small amount, 1%, that goes to job training. By category, you'll see Department of Energy is one of the major sources of IRS spending. EPA was much smaller. So a lot of this is energy related, though it's not necessarily renewable. A lot of this energy stuff is energy efficiency retrofits. Our stimulus data comes from fedspending.org. We use the universe of contracts, grants, and loans between 2009 and 2012. We have information on the expenses and the descriptions of these projects. We use the place of performance of the prime and the subprime recipients to allocate the dollar amounts to commuting zones based on the zip code. This is a little different than some of the other RS studies, which also use vendor data. We avoid using vendor data here because of our focus on how well this fits the skills of the community, right? So if there's a hazardous waste cleanup job and they have to contract out to a vendor in another community because there's nobody in that community to do that work, then that work hasn't necessarily created jobs in that particular community, right? So given our focus on places, we focus on just the prime and subprime recipients. Right? We combine the RI data with data on employment and labor market conditions. This gives us a longitudinal data set, local labor markets from 2005 to 2017. As with most of the other studies in ARA, we focus on commuting zones with populations at least 25,000. We use the share of green general skills to be able to calculate the full-time equivalent of workers that are performing green tasks. So this is a proxy for green employment. Roughly, if we look at per capita, roughly 2% of a population is working in green employment. Total employment is about 43%. Manual labor is going to be important as we see going through this, about 9.5% in manual labor. Focus on our methods and we'll get to results. So one of the challenges here is that ARA by design is targeting areas that were hardest hit by the recession, so it's potentially endogenous. A lot of the other ARA studies looking at ARA more broadly use a shift share IV approach. So a lot of the money for transportation and so on was spent using these formulas, right, based on highway miles and so on. So based on these pre-existing formulas, can use that as an instrument. That is more complicated here because of the potential for pre-ARA green spending, which we are unable to observe. And so the IV approach actually could actually make that worse. So that's consistent with Jaeger's critique of shift share estimates, and we'll show that is a problem in the paper. I'm not going to discuss that today. Our solutions instead, so we create 20 dummy variables based on non-green spending, so rating communities from lowest to highest non-green. And so we're comparing areas that get similar levels of non-green spending. This allows us to do this in a non-parametric way, not imposing a linear effect on non-green ARA. It also allows us to do some robustness checks. And what you see here, so the orange is ranking communities from the lowest to highest non-green ARA spending. And you'll see there's a lot of variation there. There are communities that get a fair amount of green, but not a lot of non-green, and vice versa. So it's that with in-group identification that we're focusing on. Second, we control for other factors that affect green stimulus spending. This includes things that will affect the economy, so such as initial employment levels, trade exposure, and things that affect whether an economy is green versus non-green, so oil and gas resources in the community, whether there's a Department of Energy lab, and environmental policy. Finally, we check for pre-trends in our data. I'll talk more about this in a minute. The main thing here is we observe pre-trends for total employment, but not for the employment most affected by green ARA, so green employment and manual labor. So we're definitely more confident in those results. Our model is a long difference model. So the dependent variable is the change between the base year of 2008 and whatever year we're looking at in different types of employment. Per capita green ARA is our main variable of interest. We allow the coefficients to vary over 3 periods, and what we present here just for simplification. So we have the pre-ARA period, the short run when ARA money was actually being dispersed, and then the long run. When we see pre-trends, and we can use that pre-trend estimate and subtract that out to get a net effect when pre-trends are present. We're going to, this assumes that there's some observable linear trend. We're going to look at other possibilities and do some more robust checks on this in the final version of the paper. Main thing to take away from this is that when we look at green and manual labor, no evidence of pre-trends, state fixed effects results are more precise, so we'll tend to focus on those. We do see pre-trends when we look at total employment. And so if we look without the pre-trends, we see employment gains in both the short run and the long run that are in the ballpark of previous estimates. If we subtract the pre-trend out, we see only employment gains in the long run, and they get very noisy estimates. So you know, whether there really are total employment gains is more difficult to say. It really depends on the assumptions of the pre-trend. You know, we can think of this as getting areas that were already doing well back to where they were, but not necessarily creating new jobs. So on total employment, you know, we want to say that our results, you know, our results are really not conclusive. If you look, however, at green and manual labor, we do see more conclusive results because the pre-trends are not an issue there. So our main takeaway is that green spending reshapes the economy. Right? Almost all the jobs created are either manual labor or green employment. So here's our results for green occupations. Well, this may look small, so about 2 jobs created per $1 million in the long run. Remember that only 2% of the population is working in green jobs. And so compared to, not netting out the pre-trend, compared to 20 jobs total, that's a fair amount of employment gain. Almost all the employment gains, we look at the results, again, kind of netting out the pre-trends, almost all the employment gains, again, acknowledging the total results are noisy, are manual labor. The employment effect works more slowly than other stimulus investments. So most of the ARA work finding fairly quick short run increases. Here, if you look at manual labor, for example, we see the long run gains twice as high as the short run gains. Finally, skills matter. Having workers in the community that have the skills necessary to do green tasks is important. So with the graph show, we on the x-axis, we have the percentile of green skills. So the low communities with low green skills to the highest green skills. And then these are the job effects, and we'll see the job effects really don't become positive until the upper third or so of green skills.
David, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. Our results are robust to lots of different changes that we discussed in the paper. And that last about a minute and a half or so, we just want to discuss kind of policy discussions and conclusions. So the main takeaway is that in 2009, green investments created jobs, but more slowly than other our investments. So the way to think of this is green spending can reshape the economy, but not really the right tool to restart the economy. Right? So better suited for long-term policy goals such as a green energy transition, right? So maybe not appropriate in the first stimulus spending, but in the kind of this idea of build back better makes more sense if we're thinking about a longer-term policy goal. Second, most jobs are created or manual labor. So this is potentially encouraging because it means it will employ workers left behind by changing environmental regulations. Because the job training requirements are higher for green energy jobs, it does suggest that spending plans that create green jobs should include some funds for job training. Finally, skills matter. So make 2 points here, right? One, again, we're thinking about the potential for short-run employment gains, right? This would not have been an appropriate policy for the initial stimulus spending when the pandemic started because the early job losses were non-occupations that use green skills. This is primarily service sector jobs and so on. Okay. Another concern is that the green stimuli may create some spatial inequities. And so I'll end with this here. So we've highlighted areas that have high amounts of fossil fuel employment, right? So we have oil up in North Dakota and Texas and Oklahoma, coal in Wyoming and West Virginia. And you'll see there are some areas such as the Dakotas where there's a good match, areas with a lot of fossil fuel workers and also high levels of green skills. There are also areas where you have lots of energy work, lots of fossil fuel work, but not necessarily the green skills that would be appropriate for a transition into the green economy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. Our first discussant is Gabe Totoro-Wright.
Okay. Thank you very much. You can see my slides. Thumbs up, Jan. Good. So it's a pleasure to discuss this interesting and very topical paper. I anticipated David would do a very clear job representing, so I'm going to jump straight into my comments. I will make 3 sets of comments. The first concerns terminology and the relationship between temporary stimulus and permanent structural transformation. The second will be to explain my view of the difficult econometric and measurement challenge the authors face in studying the green aspects of the ARRA. And the third will be to broaden a bit and think about lessons from other structural transformations. Let me start with terminology. There are 2 main reasons why policymakers might consider the green transformation in the context of managing macroeconomic policy. The first is an opportunity. Governments can pull forward green investments to periods when resources are otherwise idle, such as a recession. And that I would call economic stimulus. According to standard economic theory, temporary fiscal stimulus can increase total employment temporarily while resources are idle. Targeted investments can lead to permanent reallocation of employment toward green industries or to certain geographic areas, but they don't permanently increase the total number of jobs in the economy. And I think Valerie's going to have more to say on this. The second reason policymakers might think macroeconomically in the context of a green transformation is more of a problem. There are many workers who are currently employed in GHG emitting industries, and they are eventually going to have to find some other way of making a living. Because of frictions involving finding new employment or gaining new skills, policy might want to subsidize sustained support for the losers in the industrial reshuffling. Temporary stimulus cannot satisfy this objective because by construction it's temporary, and measures to address it shouldn't be labeled temporary stimulus. So put another way, an economic stimulus can include clean energy components. A temporary stimulus cannot resolve a structural transformation. None of this really impacts the analytical work in the paper, and I think the authors would agree with my characterization, but in places the 2 points can get a little muddled. In particular, while ARA clean energy spending was backloaded, and I'll show you that on the next slide, ex post, the economy remained very demand constrained for well after initial 2-year phase of most of the ARA. For example, the Fed didn't lift off the zero lower bound until the end of 2015. So it might not be surprising that even energy spending that happens in 2011 and 12 would have total employment effects. Theory does not predict that there would still be higher economy-wide employment in 2019 after all of the spending took place and the economy was at or past full employment. Although, of course, it could be the case that certain geographic areas continue to benefit, which highlights a distinction between local and national multipliers. So here is a figure that shows the slow spend out of the ARRA energy provisions. And here I'm just using the author's definition of spending by the Department of Energy and the EPA against all other spending and transfers. So taxes are not included in this figure. The tax cuts happened pretty quickly. So this dotted brown line shows the path of all non-energy outlays as a share of their appropriation. Most of that spending was done by the end of 2010, about 80%. The green line shows EPA spending. That was about 7 billion of the combined nearly 50 billion of BPEA and DOE, so it's a smaller share. That starts slower, primarily because there are a lot of transfers in this total line, but then it ramps up very quickly. And again, most of it is about 3/4 is done by then 2010. The Department of Energy is the red line, which is the vast amount of what the paper studies. And DOE spending had outlaid about 1/4 of its total appropriation by the end of 2010. In fact, by the middle of 2011, it still had outlaid less than half of the total. And even at the end of 2013, it's about 3/4. Another way to put that is there's about as much Department of Energy spending in 2011 and 12 as there was in 2009 and 10. So in interpreting the timing results in the paper, it's important to keep in mind that most of the spending occurs after the 2008 to 10 window, which was when most of the other ARRA spending occurred. But again, the economy is still below potential into 2012. Okay. Let me now turn to the main empirical contribution of the paper. The authors are very careful to discuss endogeneity of green spending. They include many controls. I list them here. I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see how many are in the baseline specification, and they carefully conduct many variants as robustness. I thought, given all of that, it would be useful to flesh out why theirs is such a thorny problem and give a perhaps slightly different emphasis from that in the paper. The objective is clear, is to estimate the total jobs effects of our spending on green programs. As the authors note, our spending on green programs was likely targeted towards areas with existing green infrastructure potential. So for example, R&D grants went to places with scientific laboratories already working on energy matters, and wind turbines were built in places with high wind potential. That targeting creates an econometric challenge. There's a generic concern, which is that areas with existing green infrastructure share other characteristics that made them subject to correlated shocks or have similar loadings on aggregate shocks. For example, maybe these places also had more dramatic house price cycles. This is a failure of the law of large numbers. We only have one Recovery Act to study, and it's possible that other shocks happen to impact these particular areas at the same time. The specific concern is that the economy was becoming greener even absent the ARRA. And indeed, I think the Obama administration would want credit for doing a lot more to encourage the green transition than just what was in the Recovery Act. But many of these additional policies may have disproportionately benefited places that also got lots of ARRA funds. So that illustrates why pre-trends may be an imperfect diagnostic, because the concern that other greening was occurring may have been more important post-2008 than before. It merits emphasis that this concern is very different from the typical omitted variable problem with the Recovery Act or other fiscal stimulus, which is that funds were targeted towards harder hit areas by biasing down the estimated jobs effect. Here, the direction is the opposite. Funds may have gone to areas already greening, and the additional green jobs were due to the secular transition and not the ARRA per se. Let me give an example to illustrate this point. There were large ARRA grants and tax credits to support wind and solar development and installation. These provisions obviously were most likely to benefit areas that have lots of wind and sun. We often think of the physical environment as providing great variation for estimating causal effects. So think of using rainfall shocks as an excluded instrument for income, or using physical land constraints as an excluded instrument for housing supply. But here there's a problem if wind and solar were becoming more competitive anyway. And so places with high wind and sun would have seen investment even absent the Recovery Act. This is my interpretation of why the paper controls for wind and sun potential rather than exploiting it as a physical determinant of green aura allocation. But put that way, it's immediately clear the same concern applies to any shift share design. It's a bit more subtle in the interaction specification that David discussed, where they look at areas with more or less ex-ante green suitability. But if green suitability is measured with error, then the interaction coefficient may also pick up the tendency for funds to go to areas that are expected to expand based on unobservables. Taking stock, the current iteration, I think it's a little bit difficult to follow exactly what drives these large long-run results. The paper controls for a lot, and I agree that may be necessary. It just makes it harder to assess what determines the remaining variation in green aura allocation. The fact that there are still pre-trends, at least for total employment, suggests there are some common shocks or trends affecting these areas. The authors have some of my suggestions on what else they can do. And so I'll say I look forward to seeing the next iteration on this front. There's a final challenge that arises even with a perfect research design. So the authors, based on their earlier work, define greenness by occupation rather than industry. Measuring green jobs, therefore, requires survey data with occupation codes. And in the paper, they use the American Community Survey, or the ACS. But green jobs are a pretty small share of the total economy. They're about 3% of total hours worked. So once you take the ACS and you divide it into almost 600 commuting zones, and then you restrict to the 3% of hours worked in green occupations, you wind up with pretty small sample sizes of green workers. So I have a very good RA who did an exercise of drawing bootstrap samples of each PUMA, public use microdata area, and aggregate up to the commuting zone level, and then calculate the variation in green share just due to sampling variability. Turns out the median coefficient of variation, the weighted median across commuting zones, is about 5%. What that implies is a standard deviation of about 7 percentage points. Or put differently, sampling variability alone is going to induce a standard deviation of about 7 percentage points in the growth rate of green jobs in the typical commuting zone. Of course, standard errors are going to reflect that sampling variability. My point here is simply to highlight that there's a difficulty in generating precise multiplier estimates in this setting. Finally, I will transition from discussing green stimulus to the broader aspects of the clean energy transformation. And here, I think it's useful to note that this is far from the first industrial transformation the United States or other economies have experienced. And indeed, the first part of the paper provides a very nice analysis of the skills gap between brown and green industries, motivated by lessons from these earlier episodes. I think this is really important work, and it's somewhat reassuring, though I will also note that in general equilibrium, the reallocation of workers need not necessarily involve the exact same workers moving from GHG emitting industries to green industries. There may be some intermediation in between there. Incidentally, one number I missed.
You have a minute and a half left.
Thank you. I missed is the total number of brown jobs expected to disappear, which matters a lot to how macroeconomically disruptive this will be. Figure 1 of the paper has about 250,000 workers in fossil fuel extraction generation. I think that must understate substantially the total number of workers affected. What we know about secular decline is not especially encouraging. Displaced workers often don't quickly transition to new jobs, and instead they suffer harmful long-term consequences. There's a paper at the end today on the China shock that we will hear about that's both illustrative and pessimistic in this regard. Job training may be part of the solution, but that's especially difficult for older, less educated workers. I'm not going to discuss all policy alternatives here, but I think it's just suffice to say there's not easy solutions. Let me just reemphasize my first point about this distinction between temporary stimulus and long-term solutions. Some of the proposed investments, things like plugging orphan wells, cleaning abandoned mines, might qualify as temporary stimulus. They're surely worthwhile for their environmental impact. I don't think they provide the sort of sustained alternative employment that may be called for. That said, and this is my final slide, I do think a good macroeconomic environment is conducive to sectoral transformation. So this comes from an article I wrote with Johannes Wieland on secular reallocation that's in the JPE. And our conclusion there was monetary policy might need to grease the wheels of reallocation by accommodating higher inflation. Veronica Guerreri and co-authors developed this point very nicely in their Jackson Hole paper last month. So let me just describe the result. This paper looks at whether relative wages rise faster in industries that have higher trend employment growth. And the answer in booms is that they do, which is what you would expect, and that encourages workers to flow into those industries. During recessions, that relative wage differential disappears. And a leading rationale for that is downward wage rigidity, which binds in recessions and prevents a decline in wages in the shrinking industries. The problem is without that price signal for workers to reallocate, they remain looking for work in declining industries or areas. That slows down the transformation, and it also exacerbates unemployment. So that gives a rationale for wanting a hot economy to facilitate a transition, even to tolerate possibly above trend inflation, which is certainly relevant in the current environment. Okay, so let me conclude. It's a very thought-provoking paper on a very important topic. It has many interesting results. I've tried to clarify a few aspects from my reading of the paper and to offer a few additional related directions of inquiry. Overall, I think I find myself a little bit less optimistic than the paper about the labor market challenges of the green transition, but more optimistic than before I read the paper. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Gabe. The second discussant is Valerie Ramey.
All right, thank you. Well, it was a great pleasure to read this paper because I learned so much from it, and it covered so many fascinating topics. So let me just quickly overview. David did a great job, as Gabe said, talking about the paper. It is very impressive, and it's expansive, and it covers a lot of ground. There are 3 parts to the paper, and I really recommend that everybody who hasn't read it, go ahead and read it. Perhaps my favorite part was part 2, which was the comparison of the skill requirements of green jobs with the skill endowment of workers in brown industries. That seems very, very important. They also talk quite a bit about the geographic possible mismatch, which is important. And then the crux of the paper is also the effect of the green part of the ARA spending there. So it's very ambitious, but there are many challenges to obtaining definitive answers. And I think some answers are firmer than others, and the authors recognize this. So in my discussion, I'm going to try to cover 4 topics if time permits. First, I'm going to put the authors' estimates in context because their estimates are based on local commuting zones. And I'm going to talk about 2 aspects. First of all, what this implies for the aggregate, and therefore going to talk about dynamic general equilibrium effects, but also I'm going to talk about the importance of the spending delays. The second is a comparison of their findings to findings from other infrastructure spending in the ARA, in particular highway spending. Third, I'm going to talk about some green incentives not included in the author's analysis, which is tax credits for rooftop solar. And finally, if I have time, I'm going to talk about broader impacts of the green transition on fossil fuel communities using 2 examples of one, the mining communities in Asturias, Spain, and then also Appalachia. All right, so DGE analysis and sort of putting the author's estimates in context. All right. Macroeconomists 10 years ago thought, we're so excited about the econometrics being done and applied, thought that we could apply it to answer our questions. And we quickly figured out that the effects that you get by using local or state data don't imply aggregate effects. And there are many ways that there's this break in the link between the 2. But for here, what's important is thinking about employment effects in a local area. If one area gets $1 more relative to the aggregate, it may have an increase in employment, but we don't know if that increases aggregate employment or if it's simply employment stealing effects from other localities. Now, it's important also to account for the intrinsic, what I call time to spend and time to build delays involved in any infrastructure investment. And I don't think green energy is any different. Now, dynamic general equilibrium analysis, I can't use it for all of its purposes here, but it's really useful for distinguishing between short-run transition and long-run effects. So I'm going to show you some results from a model, a few permutations on a model that I used in my forthcoming infrastructure paper. And it's a medium-scale new model. Now, I actually rigged it to give high multipliers for standard government consumption spending, just to show you how different the effects are when you have infrastructure spending particularly with the inherent lags included. All right, and so I'm going to compare the effects of government spending to government infrastructure, and in both cases, it's going to be a temporary shock to spending. All right, first, let me just show you another graph about the delays from the ARA, and this one is for the highway spending. This isn't cumulative, that's what Gabe had shown you. This is actually per year, the percent of total appropriations. So it took over a year before it reached its peak, and there was still quite a bit of spending going on in 2011 and 2012. So there are time to spend delays, and Gabe showed you the ARA spending was even slower than most other, the green ARA spending was slower than most other ARA spending. So let me show you some simulations from a new Keynesian model. Okay, so in these graphs, the black line is for a government consumption shock. So we assume it's 1% of GDP on impact, but it has some zero correlation, so it doesn't die out right away. I believe the zero correlation here is 0.7. The blue line shows you the effect for government infrastructure spending. The appropriations for it has the same pattern as for government consumption spending, but here I'm assuming it takes that it's equally distributed over 8 quarters. All right, so this is the slowdown in the spending. So from the top left graph, you can see government consumption spending spikes up and then comes back to normal within, say 3 years. Government infrastructure spending has a more prolonged response. The top right shows the effect on output. Now, as I said, I rigged this model to get nice high multipliers, higher than I've estimated in my research, but this is just a stylized model. So the multiplier is above 1, it's above 1.3 here for government consumption, but the short run multiplier is much lower for government infrastructure. And that's because even with those Keynesian bells and whistles, if the spending isn't happening, the rule of thumb, consumers don't consume, and so you don't get the high multiplier. So there you have a more prolonged effect on, or a delayed effect on output. But now notice the difference. There's a very persistent effect on output. It stays above normal for at least 10 years in this particular example. And that is because the government infrastructure builds up the capital stock and raises the productivity of labor. Now, the lower left shows employment. In the short run, the responses of employment and output look the same because all of the increase in output is because of employment. But then notice that employment goes back to normal. That's what all standard macro models will tell you. There will be no long run aggregate effect. How does output go up in the long run? It's because of that increase in productivity from the higher public capital stock. Now, private investment has all kinds of interesting things. There's actually a decline in the short run while they're waiting for the government infrastructure to be built up. And then there's a boom in private investment later. So the takeaways are delays prevent government investment from acting as a short run stimulus, and a temporary increase in government infrastructure spending should have no long run effect on total employment. And in fact, a permanent increase in government infrastructure spending should have no long run effect on aggregate employment. Okay. All right, so let me just compare the green ARA effects from the paper to the highway ARA effects. So here are some graphs from Andrew Guerin's Journal of Urban Economics one. He also looks at, I believe, commuting zones, local areas, and he looks both at the effect on construction employment and the effect on total employment. So he does have a significant effect on construction employment. And notice that his peak in 2010 is roughly where the peak of the spending was. So the employment follows what the pattern of spending is, and there's more persistent effect. Now, total employment doesn't do anything in the short run. So some, there might be some reallocation in the short run, but we're not seeing any aggregate effects. He then sees more aggregate effects later, but they're not estimated very precisely. Now let's contrast that with the current paper. And I had to go to the appendix to find what I think is a really important graph, which is year by year effects of the green ARA. So it's normalized to be 0 in 2008. And notice that they're finding, an increase after 2008 and also an even bigger increase later. And they interpret these estimates as showing long run effects on green ARA. However, the evidence of the pre-ARA trends is troubling. As you can see, there seems to be a trend before, and some of these are statistically significant. Now, to be clear, the authors worry about this as well. Now, suppose we draw a trend line. How do we do it? Well, let's suppose that green energy just started picking up around 2004. If we draw a trend line there from 2004 to 2008, we might conclude that the long run employment effects are actually below the trend line. All right. Now, this I just picked out of, well, not completely out of the air, but it just shows you how hard it is to measure what those long run effects because of these pre-trends. Okay. Now, the authors and the discussants, I think, all have concerns about the total employment results. However, Pop et al. Do go on to conduct an important analysis of the subcategories of jobs. They don't show year-by-year results in the current version of the paper. I hope they do in the next version. But their table 4 shows 2 important results for manual occupations. And David already talked about this. There don't seem to be any pre-2009 trends. And both the short run and long run employment effects are economically and statistically significant. Now, increases in local employment in certain classes of jobs is not at odds with the implication of the dynamic general equilibrium model of no aggregate effect in employment. All right. Side comments on methodology and data. I gave them some comments on an earlier version. There wasn't enough time to include them, but I really want to urge them. Macroeconomy, I tell all my students, take the applied micro classes so that they'll teach you how to identify things, and take the applied macro classes because they'll teach you how to deal with dynamics. And I would suggest that they use these local projection methods, which is a great way to handle all of this. All right. I want to talk a little bit about tax credits and rooftop solar. Believe it or not, in the late 70s, I was a college debater and I ran a solar energy case. That solar energy, and I ran it under the topic that was to provide employment opportunities for all Americans. That solar case was great because it had been run a few years before under the land use topic because people wanted to get rid of strip mining. So the idea was to use rooftop solar. It was used for employment. And then that same year in high school was the energy topic, and they ran the solar case there. So I'm a—
Valerie, you have about a minute and a half.
Got it. Thank you. All right. Now, the authors focus on direct government spending targeted at green industries, and they exclude tax credits. I think it would be useful to also study that. This would also have its own challenges. But if you look at solar employment growth, a big part of it is the installation. All right. Now, here's the effect of the tax credit on my San Diego neighborhood. All right. My house is the one on the left hiding behind the palm trees. We have 25 solar panels. You could see how many houses here have solar panels because of that tax credit. So we had people climbing around our roofs for several years because of the tax credit. Now, rooftop solar creates more jobs than solar farms do. So here's some evidence that if you look at median labor hours per residential PV, that the residential requires more labor hours. Now, you should ask, why should we choose this less efficient, as measured by labor productivity, means of installing solar energy? Well, it's because Appalachian coal miners aren't the only ones objecting to the current path of the green transition. Here's from an article from our local paper: 2 Biden priorities, climate and conservation, collide in the California desert. All right. California conservationists are very powerful. And so thinking about land use would also be useful in terms of the green transition. Let me just say that one should really worry about policies that help preserve communities. And I don't have time to go into the details about Asturias, Spain, but what happened is, even though they paid off the older coal miners, there were no jobs for the younger people. As a result, the towns and the mining areas are being depopulated, and mostly old people are left behind. Suicide rates and alcohol abuse have risen. So something going forward is, you don't just want to worry about the incumbent workers, you also want to worry about whether their kids have employment prospects. So fascinating paper. It asks all kinds of interesting questions and provides a number of really useful answers. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie. And thanks to all 3 presenters for those very clear presentations to kick off our discussion this morning. I told the authors I would try to get back to them to respond to the discussants, but I'd like to open it up to Q&A. Let me start with Jason Furman, who was the first mover with his hand up, and I'll go down the list of people with their hands raised. So if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand in Zoom. I'll go to Jason and then to Larry Meyer.
Oh, do you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So I just wanted to ask the authors what the implications of this was for welfare analysis and policy analysis. We teach our students to ignore jobs and a cost benefit. Insofar as there are jobs added, we teach them it's more likely to be a cost than a benefit because it means you need to divert resources to the activity. Gabe just frowned. It obviously depends if you're in the middle of a recession and constrained or not. But if your results are correct, how does it change the way we do cost benefit? And does it depend whether you're doing these policies at a time like 2010, which is a very unusual time in the economy, or in sort of a modal, maybe full employment, maybe not scenario going forward?
Thanks, Jason. To the authors, I'm going to take a few questions at a time so you can respond to them in groups. Larry Meyer. Larry, we need you to unmute yourself. You're not there. Larry, while you figure out the microphone, let's go to Bob Hall.
I got it. Can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Go ahead, Larry.
Okay. Thank you so much. Of course, there's much to be appreciated in this paper, but as a macroeconomist, I find some real limitations. The first thing is that the ARRA is not the right framework here. That was stimulus. That raised the deficit. That increased aggregate demand, and it wasn't paid for. Now, going forward, we want to say, what will the green agenda be? And going forward, you got to pay for it. Well, you got to pay for part of it. So did you take into account the effect of tax increases in marginal tax rates, et cetera, that would lower employment? And I think that the most important question is this really a metric we should use to evaluate the green agenda? Is it really about employment effects? No. It's about the climate crisis that would otherwise occur. It's not about employment. It's about the world we live in. So I don't find it particularly rewarding to think about it that way. Thank you.
Okay, let's take those two questions back to the authors for a quick response, and then we have more hands up, so I want to get back to the audience.
So there's a kind of a common theme with Jason and Larry, so I'll respond. I want to respond on is this the right metric? And I think economists have been trained, as Jason said, to kind of, jobs are costs. We don't worry about the net gain. We don't worry about the net effect on employment. But these policies need to be passed, right? There are a whole bunch of coal miners in West Virginia, oil workers, natural gas workers in Pennsylvania who voted for Donald Trump because they think Democrats basically ignore their concerns. And so to say this doesn't matter and it's really about a climate transition ignores the politics, that ignores, whether this actually is going to be politically feasible to do. So is it necessarily welfare enhancing? I don't think we delve into that in the paper. But I think, the question is important really for the politics and the distributional issues, because this is really a big part. And this is where this politics go on the Democratic side too. I mean, the Green New Deal is about, we don't want to tax people. We don't want to regulate people. We want to spend our way out of the climate crisis. And is it the most efficient way? No. But I mean, I don't think we can ignore that, this is what's out there politically. Should we keep taking questions? I mean, I could respond to the discussions too. I assume you want to take questions first, and we'll do that at the end if there's time.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Yep,
Let's take a few more questions. We'll go to Bob Hall and then Olivier Blanchard. Bob?
We go. Okay. Am I unmuted now?
Yes, go ahead, Bob.
This is very confusing setup. Anyway, I want to be a labor economist for a minute. And the labor economist believes that that labor market's clear and that compensated elasticities of supply are low. And that has a very strong implication for the effects that are studied in this paper, namely that the employment effects are small relative to the total effects, and the real effects are revealed in effects on wages. And we know from research that's been done in that framework that those effects are large. So it seems like concentrating on the employment effects, although I think it's compelling that they're there, it's just the beginning. And we really ought to have a parallel examination of wage effects.
Thanks, Bob. Olivia?
I think we know what non-green jobs which are going to disappear are. We can identify them very well. I'm much less sure about what the green jobs are going to be. And my sense is that they're going to change over time in fairly major ways. And if you think, for example, about the current discussion of charging stations, this is going to create charging stations everywhere in the US, presumably with a lot of local labor. But once this is done, we'll move on to something else, maybe wind turbines on a major scale, maybe a major shift to electric cars and so on. So it seems to me that, I mean, these are very interesting results, but you know, the kind of skills which is going to be needed in the future may be quite different from the kind of skills which were relevant to this particular episode. So I'd be a bit worried about, you know, using this to think about the future in precise ways. The idea is clearly right, but it may be quite different.
And let's take one more question from Heather Boucher, and then back to the authors.
Okay, great. Oh, good. Okay, you can hear me. This is really interesting paper. Thank you so much for writing it and really interesting comments. So part of what I was going to say was a little bit about what Olivier just said about the jobs that we're creating. I find these papers where we try to estimate what green jobs are going to be in the future to be both difficult and confusing, because in the future we imagine that all the cars that are going to be produced will be some form of a green job because they'll be electric vehicles, not fossil fuel driven vehicles. And so I have a bunch of questions about that, but that gets to this point about the skills and what we need. And which doesn't seem totally connected to what we tried to do with the Recovery Act, which leads me to the two other comments I wanted to make. So one is, I mean, I do think that the challenge in front of us now really isn't about stimulus. It is more about these structural transformations. And so I'm really more interested in that aspect of it. And I think this gets to Larry and Jason's questions about, you know, can we do both? You know, think about the new spending that we need to do, paying for it, but how this really is more about moving jobs from one path of jobs to a different kind of set of jobs. I mean, you're really trying to fast forward an innovation process that gets you to this new place. And so I guess my question is, I mean, do we really think that what we're learning from the Recovery Act will tell us a lot about what's happening in an economy that may be closer to full employment? I mean, to go back to Jason's question. So, so I'm underscoring a bunch of questions that were asked and bringing into the conversation, you know, some new questions about innovation. But thank you so much. Really interesting stuff.
Thanks, Heather. Why don't we go back to the authors, because there's a set of related questions you can respond to.
So thank you for those questions. So obviously I'm going to start with Heather. So I think it's a really important question. That's one that kind of overlaps with some of the stuff that the discussant said. So I think there's two issues here. So one, and this came up in the question, Olivier's question about, you know, what are the green jobs of the future going to be as well? You know, I think, you know, we need to be careful about generalizing from what we learned in 2009 to what's going on today. One thing, I've talking to people that have worked on the 2009 stimulus, you know, one of the reasons we see a lot of the increase in construction and for green jobs, there was a lot of focus on energy retrofits, not just building renewable energy. So a lot of home building, home retrofits and so on. And that was because the 2009 stimulus hit the construction industry and the home building industry. So they're trying to find a way to get those people back to work. So I think the lesson more is about being aware of the importance of the skills, being aware of the skills changing, and trying to figure out what that match is, which may be different in a 2021 stimulus. It may be different in a 2030 policy than it is today. So I think that skill match maybe generalizes, but what those skills are is something that's going to be evolving, and we need to keep watching. Bob Hall asked about the effect of wages. So in a 15-minute presentation, didn't have time to show every slide. So we do have a slide that shows the effect on wages, and the answer is there was absolutely no increase in wages in either the short run or the long run as a result of the hour spending. I'll ask I don't know if any of my co-authors want to add anything to that, but I think that's.
Let me just take the last two questions we have here from Mike Kiley and Carolyn Hawksby, at least that I have for now. Mike, you want to go ahead? Mike Kiley?
Hey, Jen, can you hear me?
Yes, Can, go ahead.
Work. So this is a really interesting paper and discussion. Thanks a lot. So my question or comment was, more along the framing of the discussion, in terms of employment effects, and stimulus, and then thinking about that, for possible future plans, which may not be stimulus, but rather focused on reallocation. So I think, an example of that is that, aspects of the Build Back Better agenda involve, new investments, but also depreciation of existing capital. Example being replacing, accelerating the depreciation of electricity generation through other means. I think in Valerie's model, right, that's not over the medium run increasing the level of capital, but rather changing the nature of capital. And I think similarly for jobs, so while the paper is really interesting, I do wonder about, the focus really being on the macroeconomic context that's conducive to structural reallocation, as Gabe mentioned, rather than sort of stimulus and how to make that most effective.
Thanks, Mike. And Carolyn Hawksby will have the last question, and then we'll go back to the authors. And maybe Jim wants to jump in here, but Carolyn first.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Dan? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for a terrific paper, all of the authors. This is really interesting. And I also thought that the two discussants did just a wonderful job. So thank you, Gabe and Valerie. My comment was very close to Olivier Blanchard's. I feel as though it's very easy to think about the non-green spending because we have a very strong idea of what those jobs are like. But the green spending looks a lot more, I guess I would say, randomly distributed to me. And I'm not, when I look over the green occupations, apart from those that are really obviously green, like solar installers or something like that, they don't seem very specific to me. So again, with just as Olivier said, as we go forward in terms of innovation in the future, are these really going to be the green jobs, or are these going to just, I'm worried about there being a pretty arbitrary section of green jobs compared to the non-green jobs, I guess I would say.
Thanks. And Jim, you want to comment quickly, and then we'll go back to the authors.
Sure. I'm just going to focus on this key question that Gabe raised and about identification. I think that whether there's a surge in green jobs in some of these locations, I think that especially if you look at, say, wind and solar, those things weren't cost competitive back then. So a lot of this was driven by policy, and the two policies that were most active were the RS subsidies and then also local renewable portfolio standards. So one thing that could happen here is taking a look at controlling for renewable portfolio standards. My sense is that this, but we should know, is that those were not particularly highly correlated. So I think that this is, I think, a good point in theory, but I'm not so sure it's important in practice in this application.
Okay, let's give the authors a couple of minutes to respond, and then we'll have a short break.
Sure. I think Jim's question is actually pretty easy because I have another paper where I've looked at innovation and these renewable portfolio standards. and they're pretty much all, they all started before. I don't think there was any policy that was added on after the recession. So I think our state fixed effects are pretty much picking up the renewable portfolio standards. To the extent they're not, that's where the controlling for wind potential. Some of the smaller tax credits and stuff that Valerie mentions may be more of a challenge because those things have been evolving over time. The solar tax credits, a lot of that is outside. There was a production tax credit in our, but a lot of that's been stuff that's been done since the recession. I think on the longer term things, I think these are great questions. Kind of what the green jobs are going to be in the future and kind of the larger framing. And I don't know that we have. I think those are questions for future research rather than things that we can really say. That we can say much about today. One thing I do want to. I think the one thing I do want to address that came up in the discussing comments, I think it's interesting, and I think it's interesting to think about when we think about the effectiveness of these policies. Is Gabe had the very nice graph about the share of the appropriations and DOE being much slower. Sonia Carley at Indiana has done a nice qualitative piece on this, interviewing people that were actually administering the money and stuff. And it's two things. One is that some of the money never got spent, and part of this actually was, it took a long time to go through permitting. There were Buy American requirements. Nobody could find LED light bulbs that were made in America to put in the buildings when they were doing the retrofits. And it's interesting to think about, when, like what the right measure is. Can we, so do we look at this and say, well, we should be using what they spent in 2011? Or do we say, well, they intended to spend this money in 2009 and 2010, and there were a lot of roadblocks that got in the way, and so because of that, the effect was slower. And so I think it's really interesting to think of, I think a timing effect is interesting, and it certainly poses some lessons for anybody moving forward into how do you make these things. I think Sonia's work something I've certainly encouraged people that are working on the policies now to look at and think about how you might make it more effective. Let's go, with the current policies. I'll ask my co-authors if they want to add anything, and then I'll let the next session begin.
Anything in a minute? Okay.
All right.
Perhaps just one thing. I think one important contribution of our way of framing the issue of green job and green skills is the measurement framework that can be used also for exploring which will be the future requirement of skills for the green jobs of the future. And I think a very promising avenue for future research is the one of using job ads to extract the skill contents of future jobs. So anyway, the measurement framework at the end of the day is the task-based framework that has been proposed by David Autor and co-authors applied to this one. And I think another important issue here is that there is a way of kind of measuring relocation cost as based on the skill distances. These are insight of our results on green skills that I think is quite crude in this empirical framework that has a lot of problems, as we all acknowledge, but is something that can be important to calibrate models of climate change with friction, where there is a lot of reallocation going on, but the total employment effects are small, and this can be a way of calibrating these types of models.
Great. Thanks, Francesco. David, thank you for a great presentation, and to both discussants and to everyone for good discussion.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.